Good evening. Welcome to the Delaware Historical Society. My name is Michelle Anstein, and I am the Assistant CEO and Chief Program Officer for the Delaware Historical Society. We're pleased tonight to host the program Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner in 1864. This program marks the last in the Delaware Historical Society's History Lives program series, and this series marks 1864, the year in which the Delaware Historical Society was founded 150 years ago. So we've been celebrating our sesquicentennial all year long, as well as in some ways commemorating the anniversary of the Civil War. Our last event on December 7th, which incidentally is Delaware Day, will be in Dover, and you might have seen if you came in through our Willingtown Square entrance that we do have postcards about this event, and we would invite you to pick one or more up if you have friends you think might be interested, and join us in Dover to celebrate Delaware Day and the last event that commemorates our sesquicentennial on December 7th. Also on December 3rd, we have flyers that are out at our Willingtown Square entrance about a book signing that will occur here. One of our Delaware Historical Society trustees, Beverly Rowland, wrote a guidebook to Delaware's historical markers, and she will be here to sign copies of her book on December 3rd, so we welcome you to join us for that as well. Well, the Delaware Historical Society is not the only historical society in Delaware to celebrate its anniversary in 2014. The Jewish Historical Society of Delaware was founded in 1974, so that means it's celebrating its 40th anniversary. And the Delaware Historical Society has been pleased to be the repository for the Jewish Historical Society of Delaware's collections and to have had a long relationship with the Society over the years. Tonight, we're pleased to partner with the Jewish Historical Society of Delaware for our program. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the president of the Jewish Historical Society of Delaware, Mr. Dan Crystal.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for joining us this evening in the Research Library of the Delaware Historical Society. We're going to hear about Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner, the first Jewish battlefield chaplain serving the U.S. military forces. And as introduced, I am Dan Crystal, and I thought I'd have to look at my notes to remember my name, but in any case, I am Dan Crystal, president of the Jewish Historical Society of Delaware. We congratulate the Delaware Historical Society on its 150th anniversary, as well as thank them for their collaboration with the Jewish Historical Society of Delaware since its founding 40 years ago. A couple of months after the colonies declared their independence from Great Britain, the state of Delaware enacted its Declaration of Rights and fundamental rules. Ironically, this occurred on September 11 in 1776. That was years before the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were adopted. Within that document, in Section 2, it stated, "All men have a natural and unalienable right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own conscience and understanding." That concept is still under attack all over the world today. Until the Civil War, only ministers of the Christian faith were permitted to serve the spiritual needs of American troops. However, Abraham Lincoln changed that with a stroke of his pen. Thereafter, rabbis from time to time visited with and served hospitalized troops, but no rabbi was selected to serve as a regimental battlefield chaplain until Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner. Rabbi Sarner's fascinating story is told by Rabbi David Wucher, close enough, through impersonation in Civil War uniform and with appropriate props. Rabbi Wucher is married with 2 daughters and is the retired rabbi of Congregation B'nai Shalom in Huntington, West Virginia. He received his education at Brandeis University and was a rabbinic classmate and friend of Delaware's Rabbi Peter Grumbacher when they were at Hebrew Union College. Rabbi Wucher is a fan of baseball and Civil War history and teaches Jewish studies at Marshall University. Rabbi Wucher tells me that Rabbi Sarner's story was so interesting that he devoted much time to extensive research in Sarner's life. Rabbi Sarner began a long tradition of rabbis serving the spiritual needs of the nation's military. In fact, my personal bar mitzvah rabbi, Harvard-educated Rabbi Jacob Kraft, came to Wilmington after seeing service as a chaplain in World War II. In any case, I am honored to welcome to Delaware and give you Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner, as impersonated by Rabbi Peter Grumbacher's good friend and colleague, Rabbi David Wucher. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And before I start, Michelle, am I sufficiently mic'd? Is my microphone working all right? Yes. Good? Yeah. Before I begin as Rabbi Sarner, that was one modern question. And I will speak, of course, as Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner. It's my honor to do so, and to tell you what I can in the time we have about his career. I, largely unknown now, but very important, I think, for reasons I will try to share with you in both Jewish and American history. My dear wife was not able to accompany me on this trip. She usually does. And one of the services she provides for humanity is that when I've spoken long enough, she very gently and lovingly begins to do this. And if I ignore her loving sign, which I've been known to do because I still have 7 pages left to talk about, and I'm having a good time, her gesture would get progressively less subtle to the point that she's doing this. But she really didn't have to do it over the course of the last few years. When I noticed members of the congregation or the audience looking at her longingly and wistfully, pleading for her to give me the cutoff sign, I figured maybe it's time to save a few pearls of wisdom for another time. So she couldn't join me tonight, but someone will help me. Please keep an eye on the time, because I could talk about the Civil War for years without stopping. And I hope some of you feel the same way. So I'm here to greet you tonight as Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner, and the fact that I'm wearing a tallis, and also a Union Army uniform gives you the first clue that I'm someone that you probably haven't seen before, a Union officer who was also a rabbi who was a Union officer during the Civil War, and there was no one else in that category during the Civil War, and I'm very proud of that distinction, which I'm here to talk to you about. After a few minutes, I'm going to take the tallis off, because you understand I'm speaking as Rabbi Sarner, and after a bit, I'm also going to take the jacket off. Do not be alarmed, doesn't mean that I'm leaving. These are Civil War uniforms were made of wool. They're very heavy. I have a vest on underneath. Do not be alarmed. And the fact that they fought major battles in July was a really dumb idea, but apparently didn't dawn on anybody at the time that it was a bad idea. So I will, do not be alarmed. If I start to take things off, I will stop before any real problem occurs. Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner. I was the only rabbi who served in uniform as a regimental chaplain during the Civil War on either side. There were other rabbis who had chaplain duties, as I will discuss, on the Union side. There were no rabbis in the Confederate Army. I was the first such Jewish chaplain in American history because, as Mr. Crystal mentioned, this was not possible until the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln had the law changed. You'd think because of that, these things I would be better remembered, but I've been generally forgotten by everybody, and I hope that nice people like yourself can help to remedy that situation now. Let me tell you my story. I was born in Germany in 1820, in eastern Germany, the area of Posen, eastern Germany, where Germany runs into what would become Poland a bit later on. And from a very young age, humble family, very young age, I knew two things. I wanted to pursue academics to the extent that I could. I loved studying philosophy and theology, and I wanted to become a rabbi. I was an only child. I wanted to become a rabbi, and from a very early age, I studied Hebrew, of course, with local rabbis, local scholars, pursued my rabbinic education and my general education at the same time. Before too much time passed, I went to the Friedrich Wilhelm University and also University of Hesse in Germany, and I was able to pursue my rabbinic and PhD programs at that time. Around 1850 or so, to make a long story a bit less long, and to get on to the really good stuff, I was ordained as a rabbi in Germany, and I also completed my PhD studies at the University of Hesse. Always very proud of my academic credentials. I began serving congregations in Germany and also teaching at university in the 1850s. Before very much time passed, though, I decided, as did many other Germans at the time, including many German Jews, that my future really lay in the United States. By the end of the 1850s, along with my new wife, Dora, I had a wife by this time named Dora, a younger woman, a very wonderful woman, my lifelong companion. We decided that my future lay in the United States. There are many reasons for this, of course. I'm sure you all recall the history, economic reasons, persecution, religious freedom, determined to go to America. So by the end of the 1850s, my papers were in order, my academic papers, my rabbinic papers, my Reispass for das Ausland in order, and I went to America in 1859. In 1859, not realizing, of course, on the boat over that I was just in time for America's greatest national crisis. Timing is everything. However, it wasn't there yet, so in 1859, I took my talus and my rabbinic credentials and began serving a congregation, first in Rochester, New York, upstate New York, landed in New York, of course, and began making contacts to get a congregation, first in Rochester, New York. Stayed there for a little while, but only about a year or so. There were some problems with the congregation's board. They had some different ideas about what a rabbi should do. I had some different ideas. I wanted to make a few changes. Pretty much a traditional rabbi, but I did want to make a few changes, because after all, it's 1859, modern times. Some of the board did not agree. Some people decided they would get rid of me. A group of dissenters who very modestly called themselves the Pious Five, great humility there, decided that too many changes were being made. One of the people who came to Rochester to speak on my behalf was Isaac Mayer Wise, whom I'd already befriended. Of course, German Jews, German rabbis, kind of a brotherhood, a fraternity. So as soon as I landed here, I contacted Isaac Wise and many other German Jewish leaders, many German Jews coming to America at this period of time, of course. Isaac M. Wise came to Rochester to speak on my behalf, but it was too late. They decided that I should leave. So that was a short, interesting introduction to America. Then I went to Shreveport, Louisiana. You see pages in a history book flying by here. If I'm trying to get to 1861, you can feel it. Shreveport, Louisiana, I had contacts there. I enjoyed that time very much. A more traditional congregation, the first one in Louisiana outside of New Orleans. I fit in there very nicely. My wife and I were very happy there. Looked like we were going to stay a very long time. But by now it's 1860 and coming up to 1861. While the congregation was doing fine, the nation as a whole was coming apart. And Louisiana, you'll recall, was going to be one of the first states to join South Carolina in the new Confederacy. Well, I didn't agree with that. I didn't like the idea of the nation breaking apart. I didn't come to America to see it broken into dozens of German-style principalities. I believed in liberty and freedom and union. Also, my trip to Louisiana brought me face-to-face for the first time with the institution of slavery. One thing, you know, to read about it. Another thing to see it up close and personal. Didn't like what I saw. So for all those reasons, I was not inclined to join the Confederacy. And in 1860 and 61, as Ulysses S. Grant said at the time, it was time for everybody to choose sides. Grant famously said at the time, there are only two political parties now in 1860, patriots and traitors. A bit of an oversimplification, perhaps, but he was right about choosing up sides. And my side was going to be with the North, not with the Confederacy. So the congregation was great, but I had to leave. So 1861, I'm headed back for New York, where I landed, where I started. And I was very much dedicated to the Union cause, very much wanted the Union to prevail, wanted the country to stay together, didn't want anything to do with slavery, so I decided that I wanted to serve the Union as a chaplain, as a Jewish chaplain. Only one trouble with that: there were no Jewish chaplains in 1861. It was against the law. The law was that chaplains in the Army, they were chaplains, of course, there have been chaplains since colonial times, they were to be ministers of a Christian denomination, ordained ministers of a Christian denomination. That was the law. Really hadn't been a problem before 1861. There were so few Jews in the country in colonial times, no one really raised the issue. But by 1860, the situation had changed. By then, there were at least 150,000 Jews in America. Some say maybe a little bit more than that. And there were thousands of Jews enlisting in the Union Army. And some Southern Jews, of course, in the Confederate Army. But the lion's share served the Union Army. Thousands of Jews now, at least 7,000 or 8,000 Jews served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Some say there might have been more. And the issue of a Jewish chaplaincy was raised then for the first time. But it was against the law. The law was clear: ordained ministers of a Christian denomination. The issue came up pretty quickly. In the fall of 1861, there was a young man named Allen who was appointed to serve as a lay chaplain of his Pennsylvania unit. He was not a rabbi, but he was an educated Jewish fellow, actually studied with Isaac Leeser, famous leader, of course, of Philadelphia Jewry. He was an educated layman. He knew his stuff. He was appointed chaplain of a Pennsylvania regiment, and everything was fine, except very soon thereafter, somebody came by from the United States Christian Commission, an organization formed early in the war to make sure that all the troops were educated and were directed in the proper Christian path, and made a complaint. This is no good. You can't have this. This man is neither Christian nor a minister. He can't serve as a chaplain. The law is clear. Well, so Mr. Allen had to resign his post with some humiliation, frankly. Well, the colonel in charge of that regiment thought that wasn't fair, so he got a rabbi from New York, a rabbi named Fischel, a well-known rabbi from New York, to come and serve as a chaplain. He's ordained. Well, he wanted him to serve as a chaplain. That was denied also because he was ordained, but he was not an ordained Christian minister. The Secretary of War at the time said, no dice, no good, have to be a Christian minister to serve as a chaplain. Now the Jewish community as a whole got involved. Again, there are thousands of Jews in the Union Army. Leaders like Isaac Mayer Wise and Isaac Leeser and Samuel Isaacs of the New York Jewish Messenger and other national leaders got involved. This is not fair. This issue needs to be brought to the attention of President Lincoln. So Rabbi Fischel and others, on behalf of what was known as the Board of Delegates of American Israelites, went to Washington to raise the issue with President Lincoln. Why can't we have rabbis serve as chaplains? Why can't there be a Jewish chaplain for the Jewish troops, for all the troops? Why isn't that possible? In December of 1861, Rabbi Fischel, to his own surprise perhaps, got an audience with President Lincoln. As you can imagine, President Lincoln had lots of people who wanted to talk to him, and this really wasn't at the top of his list of issues, but he got an audience, he brought the issue to Lincoln's attention, and Lincoln agreed that this was wrong. He was not familiar with the issue, he hadn't heard about it before, but this was wrong. There should be the chance for rabbis to serve as chaplains in the Army, and for Jewish troops to have a chaplain of their own faith, not just Christian ministers. Lincoln agreed that the law should be changed, and he put his stamp for approval on it and sent it to Congress. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but it took Congress a while to act on this. Imagine that. But by the fall of 1862, Congress had changed the law. They changed the law to read that a chaplain for a military unit should be an ordained minister or ordained clergyman of some religious denomination, some legitimate religious denomination, properly ordained, legitimate denomination, not something that Uncle Max made up yesterday, a legitimate denomination. And that opened the door for rabbis to serve as chaplains. Now, it took a while for this to happen. There were hospital chaplains assigned first. A rabbi from Philadelphia, in fact, from Rodef Sholem in Philadelphia, named Frankel, served as a hospital chaplain first. He was appointed to serve Jews who were wounded in the Philadelphia area. A rabbi named Gotthelf was appointed to serve wounded Jews in hospitals in the Louisville area. But the question still remained, what about a rabbi serving as a regimental chaplain, in uniform, in the Army? That had not happened yet, and that's where my story comes in, because I was the first and only one to receive that appointment. In the spring of 1863, I was appointed chaplain, the only chaplain of the 54th New York, part of the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, the army, of course, that was up against Robert E. Lee in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. The chaplain of the 54th New York, and, of course, able to wear the uniform as the other chaplains did. Now, how did I get this appointment? Well, for one thing, I've been knocking on doors for the previous 2 years, offering my services to be ready when the law would be changed. I figured it would be changed. I was ready. I knew some of the people in the area. There were some Jews. There were Jews in this unit. What really sealed the deal was this was one of the many all-German units in the Army of the Potomac. You may recall there were dozens of all-German units in the Union Army. Some in the Southern Army too, but especially in the Union Army, there were dozens of all-German units. And what they needed more than anything was a chaplain, along with other officers, who spoke German. And the 54th New York, the officers of each regiment chose their own chaplain. They were broad-minded to the point they didn't care if a rabbi, a minister, it didn't matter. A nice person, an ordained minister, who spoke German, especially when the shooting starts and the troops need to hear instructions in language they understand. When the shooting starts, it's important to know if somebody said go forward or back, go left or right. It's a matter of life or death. Someone who could talk to them in German. And of course, when soldiers were wounded, were dying in the hospital, and needed comfort, need to have it be in a language they understood. So the fact that I was from Germany, fluent in German, of course. There were Jewish soldiers in the unit. The leaders were broad-minded. Rabbi, no problem. The law had been changed. All of this came together in the spring of 1863, and I was assigned to be the only chaplain of the 54th New York and the only rabbi serving with a regiment, a military regiment in the Union Army. The only one there would be, too. Nobody else did this during the Civil War. Now, what sort of uniform should I wear? Well, this is interesting. There were conflicting regulations. The regulations said a chaplain should wear a black frock coat and a black hat. But the regulations also said chaplains are to have the rank of captains of cavalry, which is why I'm wearing a captain's uniform with the yellow shoulder boards of the cavalry. Chaplains are captains, hard to say that fast, chaplains are captains of cavalry with all the ranks and privileges of a captain of cavalry, but they're also supposed to wear a black frock coat and regular minister's attire. Contradiction. Those of you who have served in the military may understand sometimes the regulations are a bit confusing. Well, some of the chaplains wore the black frock coat. I started out doing that. But for one thing, people didn't know if you're in the Army or not. And troops complain, literally troops complain, with a black frock coat you look too much like a funeral director. And one thing you don't want the troops to be thinking when you're trying to comfort them before the battle is that you're getting ready to conduct their funeral. Another problem, again, who's in the Army, who's not? You have to be in the Army. There's a story, a true story, as far as I know. General McClellan once encountered a chaplain. General George McClellan, of course, Union Army commander, early commander of the Army of the Potomac, encounters a chaplain and says, wearing a black frock coat, and says, what are you doing in my camp? And the chaplain says, I'm a chaplain, I'm a captain of cavalry. And McClellan says, you're wearing an ordinary black coat. I recognize no one as a captain of cavalry unless he's wearing a captain's uniform. You should be wearing a blue captain's uniform with a hat and everything. That's how I know you're in the Army. And the minister thought, I think McClellan is right. For one thing, if you're in the Army, you have to be in the Army. You have to be recognizable to the soldiers as a fellow soldier, an officer. And by the way, McClellan is the general in charge of the Army. So even if he's wrong, he's still right. Rule number 1 in the Army, the general is always right. Rule number 2, if the general is wrong, see rule number 1. But McClellan had a point. The chaplain is an officer. He's serving in the Army. He's in the Army. You're not doing this part-time. The hospital chaplains did wonderful work, but this was part-time work. The Jewish hospital chaplains, the ones I mentioned, very important work, but part-time. They still serve their civilian congregations most of the time. Well, I'm in the Army. I'm moving with the troops. I'm on the move. I'm sharing everything with them. This is my full-time job. I'm in the Army, so I have to wear an Army officer's uniform. And I was very proud to do that, to wear the uniform of an officer in the Union Army. I was very proud to do that, and this is what I wore. When I conducted services, I, of course, would wear more of the black frock coat and the tallis and the skull cap and everything else, but the rest of the time, the Union Army officer's uniform. This was a source of great pride to me, the first rabbi in American history to be able to wear this uniform, but also, the other side of the coin, you have an officer's uniform on, you also look like an officer to the enemy. And when the shooting starts, the Civil War was a nasty business. Sharpshooters on both sides are trained to shoot officers. You demoralize the other army, you ruin their plans by killing the officers. So you also look like an officer, as you are, to the enemy. And the fact that you're a non-combatant, I didn't carry a weapon, I'm a non-combatant, when the shooting starts, the other side has no time for that kind of identification. You're wearing blue, you're wearing the captain's bars, bang. Some chaplains actually carried swords. You weren't supposed to, but some did because they thought it looked spiffy. I tried that for about 2 days, almost cut off my own leg 3 times, said that's enough of that. Some chaplains carried pistols. You're not supposed to, you're non-combatant, but look spiffy again, I'm only going to shoot somebody on our side, so forget that. But to the enemy, of course, you are a target because you're an officer. That's the other side of the coin. A number of chaplains were killed by enemy fire, and many more were wounded because this is what you look like. You look like any other Union officer, and when the shooting starts, that's going to make you a target. Still very proud to wear the uniform, of course. Now, what were my duties as a chaplain? Well, remember, I'm still a rabbi. I'm still a rabbi first, so I'm going to serve the Jewish troops. We're going to have Jewish Sabbath services. We brought along some items here to display. The Torah scroll, the other Jewish items. I'm going to conduct services on Friday night and Saturday for the Jewish Sabbath, Jewish holiday services as well. I'm going to pass out literature. All the chaplains had tractates. The Christian chaplains had tractates, pamphlets about their religion. So I had tractates with the help of friends in the Jewish press. And let me add, as soon as I was appointed, it was all over the Jewish press in America. Isaac Wise's American Israelite, the Jewish Messenger in New York, other Jewish periodicals picked up the story. A rabbi is in uniform for the first time ever. A Jewish chaplain in the army for the first time. This was big news for Jewish America in 1863 and 4. So I had tractates for the troops about Jewish holidays and prayers, information. Other troops could share it, of course, too. And all the accoutrements you'd need for Jewish holidays. Hard to get a lot of the Jewish foods. We ate hardtack, of course, in the Union Army, as they all did. We had to pretend this was matzah in the springtime. If it's possible for something to taste worse than matzah, this is it. Believe me, it was easy. We felt like slaves. Please get us out of Egypt quickly, because this stuff tastes awful. But it filled the bill. We found bitter herbs everywhere. We found wine. Let's not ask how we did that, but we found wine. And we had Passover Seders for the Jewish troops, all necessary, of course, services. But as the chaplain for the whole regiment, on Sundays we had non-denominational services. I served all the troops. We talked about God, of course, in general terms. We talked about faith, loyalty, duty, honor, country, the righteousness of our cause. I would read passages. This is a book I studied in Germany, by the way, printed in Germany in the 1820s. I would study passages from the book of the prophet Amos, like this one, V'yigal kamayim mishpot utzedokor kenachal eson, utzedokor kenachal eson, Ashkenazic, of course, in the 1860s. Let justice roll like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, Amos chapter 5. Well, that's for everybody. We're fighting for justice and righteousness. Remember when I was appointed in the spring of 1863, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was not only now to preserve the Union, but to end slavery, that put it on a different level. Well, we talked about duty, honor, country, faith, loyalty, and of course, non-denominational services for everyone as the chaplain for the whole regiment. What else did I do? Well, many other duties, of course. I served as a comforter, I hope, to everyone. I served as a kind of postmaster and paymaster to the troops as well. With a haversack such as this, I would deliver their mail and mail letters for them. Many of the troops were illiterate during the Civil War. They could speak German and a little bit of English, but they really couldn't read or write. So I would write letters for them. I also teach some of them how to write and how to read. Rabbi's a teacher after all, right? So teach them whatever they need to know. And I would deliver their mail and read them their letters from home. Letters from home, of course, terribly important in any wartime. I would help them with the postmaster duties. And also paymaster. When they got their pay, I would help make sure it got to their homes. These men all had wives and children at home who were really struggling to stay afloat, so I would mail most of their pay home. And you had to do that very quickly, because in military camps, especially in between the battles, there were lots of people who were eager to help relieve the soldiers of their excess pay. Men and women. Now, let's not go into too much detail here, because there are young people present somewhere, which anybody under my age, by the way, is a young person, who would relieve the soldiers of their money if you didn't get to them in time. Men and women both. Let's just leave it at that. So with special envelopes the Army had for me to mail their pay home, I have here examples of Civil War currency. This is one of my favorites here. In the Civil War, there was a bill for $1.50. You know, it makes sense. You got two of these, you got $3. What's wrong with that? $1.50. I guess at some point we decided that didn't make sense, but it's an authentic Civil War bill, $1.50. Okay, so I would get that from them and mail it home, serve as postmaster, paymaster, try to help them with that. And of course, try to help the troops deal with all of the issues that soldiers face in wartime. Loneliness, many of these kids away from home for the first time. Alcoholism, a big problem in wartime. A lot of drunkenness is a big problem. Gambling, other addictions. Fear, legitimate fear. Battles are coming up, and a lot of these men are not going to survive, and they know that. You know the old saying, you're not paranoid if somebody is really trying to kill you. Well, a lot of these men are going to be killed, and they know that, and try to help them deal with that. If our cause is just, if we have faith in our cause, then we're going to go forward anyway, but some of us aren't going to come back. And of course, when the shooting starts, to help the wounded, to comfort the wounded, the dying, those who are going to die, to be with them, speak to them in their language, or in Hebrew if they're Jewish, try to be with them to the last moment. One of my primary duties, every day, to go to the hospital, the Union Hospital, to visit the sick, the wounded, or those who are just diseased. You may know, I bet you do, that a lot more people died of disease during the Civil War than of battle wounds. So there are always people in the hospital needing comfort and care, regardless of their faith, of their denomination. I visit them every day and try to bring them whatever comfort that I could. And this is especially true, of course, when the shooting started, when all of these duties were, of course, magnified. I mentioned I joined the Union Army, the 54th New York, the Army of the Potomac, in the spring of 1863. Well, just in time for the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was a disaster for the Union. And the German troops of the 11th Corps got the brunt of it. Stonewall Jackson made a brilliant surprise attack that hit the 11th Corps, hit the German troops, who were totally surprised and routed. And they were blamed by the rest of the Army, frankly, for the defeat at Chancellorsville. Vilified by the rest of the Army, with all the other problems we had. Referred to as Flying Dutchmen. Dutchmen being a corruption of Deutsch for German soldiers, or our commanding general was General Oliver Otis Howard. We were known as Howard's Cowards after Chancellorsville. German vermin, and other epithets I can't repeat in polite company. We were blamed for the defeat. So the German troops of my unit especially, the whole Corps really, but the 54th especially, looking forward eagerly for a chance for redemption. Let's get back at the rebels. We want to prove that we're not cowards, we can fight. And of course, the spring of 1863 turns to June. Next thing you know, we're on the march going into Pennsylvania. And here's the chance for redemption, big time. It's time for Gettysburg. And beginning of July, of course, 1863, I and my unit, the whole Corps, we find ourselves at Gettysburg on July 1st. And, of course, the biggest battle of the war is underway. The 11th Corps and my unit in the middle of it from the beginning. The first day it goes very badly for the Union again. It's like Chancellorsville all over again. Second day went better, and after that things got better for the Union. My unit's in the middle of it, driven back on the first day through the town of Gettysburg, but driven back to Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Turned out to be a very strong defensive position, I hope most of you know. Second day, terrible fighting there, and all through the day there's fighting there. I'm trying to help with the wounded. All the chaplains are helping with the wounded. The medical corps is always overwhelmed in the Civil War. They're always understaffed. No one expected the number of casualties that they had in the Civil War. They're totally unprepared for this. First Bull Run shocked the nation. As someone in blue, I call it Bull Run. First Bull Run shocked the nation with maybe 5,000 casualties total, both sides. Gettysburg more than 10 times that number of casualties, just a couple of years later. No one was prepared for that. The medical corps was totally overwhelmed. So chaplains tried to help out, offering simple medicines to troops, bandaging the wounded, bringing them water, carrying them literally. There weren't enough people to carry them. The system of ambulances not worked out until very late in the war. Doing what we could to help the wounded, to help the doctors, help the nurses who were being overwhelmed. Well, of course, when you're doing this, you're right up to the front lines. You have to be at the front lines. And remember, I'm wearing a blue officer's uniform. Imagine what's going to happen. Confederates are firing at us all day. Late at the night on July 2nd, the Confederates made a massive assault on Cemetery Hill. Early's men, tough fighters, men from Louisiana mostly, they almost broke through. It was the closest they came to a breakthrough that whole day. If the Confederates break Union lines on July 2nd, the battle is over. They win. There is no Pickett's charge. But they didn't. It came close, but they didn't. Our troops held, terrible casualties, lots of people wounded, lots of people dying, and in the middle of all this, I get shot myself. Up at the front lines, helping with the wounded, officer's uniform, only a matter of time. I was shot in the leg. I received a very serious wound in my leg, and suddenly I'm one of the wounded being carried back to the rear. So that's the end of the Battle of Gettysburg for me. The next day I had a good view of picket charge from the rear lines, and I saw what happened, but I was already back in the hospital station. Serious wound in the leg, and out of the Army for a while. But the Union lines held, and in spite of the casualties, it was a success. I'm catching my breath here before I go on. Is everybody still with me? Okay. You see the pages whizzing by, Bruce Catton or Shelby Foote or Ken Burns documentaries. 3 hours of Ken Burns film whizzing by here. I'm doing the best I can. I came back to the Army. I wasn't through being in the Army. I came back in late 1863 through all of 1864. But like a lot of people in wartime, chaplains or otherwise, I left the hospital before I was really healed. Some of you have served, you know what I mean. You want to get back to your unit, your comrades, your buddies, your band of brothers. You don't want to be a shirker. So I left the hospital before my leg was healed. I went back to serve as a chaplain, but my leg kept getting worse. The 11th Corps was sent to South Carolina, so I was part of that campaign, 1863 and 1864, a campaign to capture Charleston, South Carolina for the Union cause, and to recapture Fort Sumter. Of course, a very important psychological blow, it would have been, if it had been successful, to the Confederacy. The campaign was a failure. A lot of troops got killed, and nothing much was accomplished. Charleston didn't fall until almost the end of the Civil War. But we were there for 1863, 1864, and doing the best I can, trying to minister to troops who were getting progressively demoralized because the campaign's going nowhere, and they're getting bored and depressed at the same time. But at the same time, my leg is getting worse. And finally, by the end of 1864, I just couldn't serve anymore. A lot of walking involved, a lot of horseback riding involved, just couldn't do it anymore. So I was discharged, honorably discharged, of course, because of physical disability at the end of 1864. Still, though, the first and only rabbi to serve as Union chaplain in uniform, in a Union Army officer's uniform in the Civil War, and served for about 18 months, a little more than 18 months. The average chaplain, by the way, in the Army served for about a year. It was difficult work. About a year. I served for 18 months. I wanted to mention, too, to get in the chaplain's appointment, I lied about my age. I told them I was younger than I was. I was in my mid-40s by then. I told them I was in my mid-30s. I guess they believed me. So I hope God will forgive me. I lied about my age to get into the Army. Some people lied to get out of it. I lied to get into the Army, and they believed me. So God will have to forgive me for that. But I finally had to leave because of the wound getting worse. And to just finish up the rest of my story before I stop, went back to New York for a while to serve a congregation, then decided to go to Memphis, Tennessee. The war was over by now. I decided to do my little part. I liked Louisiana before the war, except for the secession and slavery part. I liked the people. So I decided to do my little part for North-South reconciliation, right? I was going to take this off, wasn't I? I think it's a good idea. Talk about Memphis, Tennessee. It's hot there. I made myself hotter. Hi. I took a congregation, and am I still on microphone-wise? Memphis, Tennessee, do my little part to help the North and South get back together. And there we had some good news and some very bad news. The good news is that after thinking for years that we would never be able to do it, my wife and I had a child. My wife Dora and I had a child. I was already in my 50s by then. And, of course, now that's very young, but at the time it seemed like it was old. She was not too far behind. We thought it couldn't happen. Then I remember the story of Abraham and Sarah. No, it's not too late. We had a little girl named Martha, the apple of my eye, the joy of my later life. The bad news was that while things were going fine with the congregation in Memphis, Memphis was hit by a terrible yellow fever epidemic. You may recall that in the 19th century especially, and towns around the Mississippi River were especially susceptible to yellow fever. They didn't know how to cure it, didn't know what caused it. Memphis had a bad one in 1873, and then a much worse one in 1878. The population was decimated by thousands. Thousands of people left the city. I sent my wife and daughter away for their safety, but like a number of religious leaders, I decided to stay. People were suffering, just like during the Civil War again, 15 years before. People were suffering, people were hurting, people were dying, not only Jewish people. I and many other religious leaders decided to stay and do what we can to comfort those who were sick and those who were dying. Many people did that. And unfortunately, among those who, when you stayed, there was the risk you would contract the disease yourself. very contagious. And that's what happened to me. In 1878, I got yellow fever myself. I wasn't going to run away from the problem. I didn't run from Confederate bullets. I wasn't going to run from yellow fever. But unlike at Gettysburg, my luck didn't hold, and I died in 1878 at the age of 58. I'm buried in a cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, in Baronhurst Cemetery, traditional cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, plot Z-134. You can still visit. Be glad to have more visitors. Plot's kind of in bad shape. They should do something about it. But I'm buried there since 1878. My daughter lived until the mid-20th century. By the way, I want to tell you, I'm not supposed to say much, but from heaven you can actually follow the fortunes of your family in ways I can't discuss. You actually follow your family's fortunes, and you can help them from heaven. But I can't say any more about it now. Strict orders from the boss, the real general. So that's my story. And why is this story important? Let me conclude by wondering, why is this story important? For a number of reasons, I think. One, of course, one obvious one, and then one a bit more important. Let me talk a bit slower now, because are we still okay on the time? Good. Somewhere I can feel my wife doing this, gently, so far subtly, gently. One reason that one of the staples of anti-Semitism over the history has been that Jews don't fight in wars. And it wasn't long after the Civil War that happened in America, too. There are people who said, a famous article was written, people who said, I served in the Union Army, I never saw a Jewish soldier. Jews don't fight in war. Even Mark Twain wrote something about that briefly. Well, there are many answers to that. Of course, they compiled lists of Jewish soldiers. We've done this over the years. One possible answer, well, if there are no Jews in the Union Army, why was there a rabbi at Gettysburg? A rabbi who was there because there were lots of Jewish troops there. By the way, he was wounded there. You know, if you're asked the question in the late 19th century, were you in the Civil War? The best possible, most powerful answer was, yeah, I was at Gettysburg. I was wounded at Gettysburg. What were you doing? Pretty good answer. That's one small reason this is important. Another one, even more important, I think, is the question of what kind of country is America going to be? Is America really going to have freedom of religion, equal treatment for all religions, fairness for everyone, all religions being treated the same? As you know, the founding documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, everything else says that we're supposed to have that, but are we really going to have that? Well, my career, my story helps to answer that question, I think, in the affirmative. Are rabbis going to have the same rights as ministers and priests to serve as chaplains in the army, to wear the Union Army uniform? Are Jewish soldiers going to have the same right as their Christian colleagues, comrades, to have a chaplain of their own faith? Before the Civil War, the answers to those questions were no. No, don't be ridiculous. After my story, after my career, there's a different answer to that question. Yes, they are. Yes, rabbis will serve as officers in the Union Army. Yes, Jewish troops will have Jewish chaplains. Yes, religion will be treated equally. We heard these promises before in Europe, in many parts of Europe, many parts of the world. We heard these promises before as Jews, but they were not honored. America is going to be different. America is going to keep that promise of religious freedom and equality for everyone. Not just words on paper, but words actually true in real life. As one of my older relatives used to say, in America I can go to synagogue whenever I want and not have to worry about getting bashed in the head by somebody going to or from. And if I do get bashed in the head, I can call a cop. Whereas in Europe, it was the cops who were bashing me in the head, and you couldn't call anybody. America's going to be different. He would also say, I can come home from a hard day's work and not have to worry about finding a notice of expulsion on the door. Jews, get out. Commonplace in Europe, not in America. And you may recall during the Civil War there was a terrible episode where General U.S. Grant tried to expel the Jews from his part of the country, which at the time was the Department of Tennessee. It was Western Tennessee, Western Kentucky, Northern Mississippi. Grant issued an infamous order expelling the Jews, December of 1862, right around the time that I was trying to get into chaplaincy. All these issues were in play. But as soon as he got wind of it, Lincoln canceled it. Lincoln canceled it as soon as he got wind of it. Isaac M. Wise and others went to Washington, D.C. By the time they got there, Lincoln had already canceled the order and told Grant, we don't do that in America. That's in Europe, not in America. He told Grant, first of all, I make those kind of decisions. You just fight the battles. And secondly, he told Grant, if you have problems with individual Jews who you think are breaking the laws or hurting our cause, Lincoln had no problem prosecuting individuals who are hurting the Union cause. He was a tough cookie, but we don't expel whole groups of people. Before too much happened, some Jews were expelled from places like Paducah, Kentucky, and Holly Springs, Mississippi. Before too much happened, Lincoln canceled the order. Orders of expulsion were commonplace in Europe for centuries. Would that be the case in America? Would Jews actually have equality and freedom in America, or is it just talk? Well, the Civil War, my career, what Lincoln did, helped to answer those questions in a way that was new. And let me tell you, by the way, what I did in my career, my modest career, was known in Europe. There were European journals were writing about this. The American Jewish press publicized very much my career as the first rabbi in the Union Army, the only rabbi in the Union Army, and this news was sent to Europe. A French Jewish publication made me smile. It said, I was the first rabbi to be wounded in combat since Rabbi Akiba was fighting the Romans. A bit of an exaggeration, perhaps, but me and Rabbi Akiba in the same sentence, that's pretty good company. This was known in Europe, and Grant's order of expulsion was known to the Jews in Europe, and the fact that Lincoln squashed it. And God bless Lincoln, by the way, a weaker president wouldn't have stood up to Grant. Grant was the only Union general who was winning. Remember the line, some people complained to Lincoln that Grant was drinking too much, and Lincoln said, find out what his favorite liquor is and send a case to all of our other generals, because he's the only one who's winning. A weaker president would have said, I can't antagonize Grant. We need him. But Lincoln said, no, we need him to fight battles. Forget about making policies about Jews or anybody else. So he canceled the order right away. This was known in Europe. And I think these were factors in European Jews deciding that America was worth a shot. We would have a fair chance here, a real chance at freedom and equality. Rabbis serving in the army, Jewish soldiers having Jewish chaplains, orders of expulsions being canceled. All this happening in the 1860s was one of the many factors that convinced many European Jews that America was a good place to go. You had a real fair chance here to have a life of dignity and freedom. And the Jewish population in America swells from about 150,000 in 1860 to several million by the early 20th century. This is one of the reasons why. They heard that in America, Jews could get a fair shake. Not a free ride, just a fair shake. A real chance of freedom and equality without somebody bashing you in the head or telling you to get up and leave because you're a Jew. No, that was Europe. America's going to be different. And my story is part of that process, an important part of that process. Individuals may still be prejudiced. Of course, that will be true until God's kingdom breaks forth in the world. I heard plenty of individual prejudice when I served in the Army, don't worry. But as far as the government is concerned, the federal government, religions are all to be equal, and your religion is your own private business. In the middle of the 19th century, this was a stunning step forward. Stunning, especially for Jews, and for America too, I think. And it helps explain more than anything why so many Jews decided to come here. And I'm glad to have played a small role in that happening. As I said at the outset, since I died in 1878, I seem to have been completely forgotten by everybody. But I understand there are some good people in places like West Virginia and Maryland and Delaware who are interested in bringing me back to a certain modest amount of public attention, and blessings upon those who do. I think it's a story that should be told. It's part of American history, it's part of Jewish history, it's part of the Civil War, which is kind of an important period of time. It's a story that really needs to be told, and I want to thank you very much for letting me tell it to you tonight. Thank you. And we have time for a few questions, Michelle, a few questions or comments. And again, pardon me for talking fast, but a lot to cover. I am, by the way, let me add, if I may put in a shameless plug, I'm writing a book about Rabbi Ferdinand Leopold Sarner. I'm speaking now as myself, Rabbi David Wucher, of course. I'm Rabbi David Wucher from Huntington, West Virginia, a classmate of Rabbi Peter Grumbacher of Wilmington, Delaware. And I'm writing a book. I've just about written it. I'm hoping to have it published next year. It's going to be called The Rabbi of Gettysburg. And I can tell you from being involved in Civil War reenactments and living history, one thing that Civil War enthusiasts love, I've been one my whole life, is something they didn't already know. You know, I know about Gettysburg, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Pickett's Charge, Antietam, Cornfield, Bloody Lane, Burnside's Bridge, I knew it 50 years ago. Oh, there was a rabbi at Gettysburg, really? Most Civil War enthusiasts don't know that, and they love to hear stuff they didn't know. I was at Gettysburg last year, the 150th anniversary commemoration, doing a living history presentation, and I had all kinds of people stop by, and the most common comments were, there was a rabbi at Gettysburg? Yes. He was in the Union Army? Yes. He was wounded? Yes. You yourself are a rabbi? Yes. From West Virginia? Yes. And then their heads would explode, because that's way too much information for people. But for those who can handle a little bit more, I've written a book about him called The Rabbi of Gettysburg. I hope to have published next year, in which I hope to bring Rabbi Sarner back to at least a modest amount of acclaim that he deserves for his role in history. The only Jewish person anybody really knows from the Civil War period is Judah Benjamin, who was Secretary of State of the Confederacy. The Confederacy, who was an advocate of slavery. Daniel Webster referred to him as an Israelite with the heart of an Egyptian, because he missed 17,000 Sunday school lessons about the Exodus from Egypt. God doesn't like slave masters. Hello. So it's time we knew about somebody Jewish in the Civil War besides Judah Benjamin of the Confederacy. How about a Union guy? How about a Union rabbi? How about Ferdinand Leopold Sarner of the 54th New York? So one of my missions in my retirement years is to give him some of the modest acclaim that I think he deserves. And I have some other items here you might want to look at later that he would have carried into his Union encampments. Jewish items, general items. They have a Torah scroll, as I said, haversack, a canteen, Jewish and military items that Rabbi Sarner would have had. Also have a picture of him. There's only a couple of pictures, but I have a couple, and he looked a lot like me. As a rabbi, he had a beard. Imagine that. And he had glasses. Imagine that. He looks a lot like me, a very handsome devil. And I've got the picture, too, if you want to see that. So I wanted to give that little plug, too, for the book that should be coming out next year. And again, I thank you for your attention. Questions, please. Questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Being that I am a reenactor, and obviously being the main staple of food for the Union Army is pork. What is, and you may have come across this now as far as how can you handle this with the Jewish soldiers themselves? Because obviously being Jews and actor would probably been more likely to eat kosher than it was necessarily today.
Well, I'll tell you, answering this myself, I had the honor of serving as a chaplain in the U.S. Army myself in the 1970s. I'm a former U.S. Army chaplain for real, not only in reenacting in the 1970s, the late Vietnam period. I had to deal with that issue myself. And it's funny, sometimes chickens come in very strange forms. You know, in God's wonderful world, there are many different variations of animals, and you just have to do the best you can. I mean, when you're out on the march, I stayed stateside. I was Vietnam era, but I asked for an assignment in the United States, and they sent me to Louisiana instead. Well, lots of people wanted to hear about the Union Army, let me tell you. But you do the best you can. You try to observe as many of the rules as you can. When it's wartime, actual shooting, you get a kind of you get compassion, you get a break. You know, you're supposed to, in the Bible it actually says you're supposed to live by the commandments, not die by them. And you have to eat whatever you can. You try to follow the rules, you eat eggs, you eat bland stuff. You try to get unleavened bread for Passover. When I was a chaplain in the 1970s, they would send me kosher wine. And the Army being what it is, some of you will know this phenomenon, either I got one bottle of kosher wine or 1,000 bottles. It's the Army, it's the government, either feast or famine. When I had one bottle of kosher wine, attendance service was very small. When I had 1,000 bottles, many of the troops suddenly realized they had Jewish ancestry. They'd never realized it before. And I had a lot bigger attendance. And afterwards, that wine was gone. That wine was gone. So you did the best you can. You try to follow the rules. There's a wonderful true story about Jews trying to observe Passover in 1862 in what is now West Virginia, having a little bit too much wine and beginning to fight each other, and who was Moses, who was Pharaoh, and there was no chaplain around. So you did the best you can. That's all you can do. I did the same thing when I was a chaplain. God is merciful and forgiving and compassionate, and you just do the best you can. Yes, another question somewhere? Yes?
What's your understanding about why there was a rule to expel Jews from the army? Was it plain anti-Semitism?
Oh, you mean Grant's rule?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it also partly based on whether Jews were merchants and they were selling to both sides of the conflict? Do you think that was an excuse for anti-Semitism?
Yes. It's a long story, of course, and there's a lot written about it since 1862. There's a recent book came out called When Grant Expelled the Jews by Jonathan Sarner, a professor, I think it was at HUC for a while. He was at Brandeis for a while. It's complicated. Let me just say, Grant was a man of his times. There was a lot of anti-Jewish prejudice in the 19th century. Jews seen as Shylocks, loan sharks, unscrupulous war profiteers. There was some of that. Remember, it was Grant who said it's only patriots and traitors. There were some Jewish merchants involved, as there were many other merchants involved in war profiteering, black marketeering, selling goods to the Confederacy, of course, which was a terrible thing. Grant saw things in black and white. Some Jews are involved, so get rid of all the Jews. Solve the problem. There are those who say his father was involved in psychologizing Grant. His father was involved in this. It's complicated, but some Jewish merchants were involved, and Grant said, so expel them all. Lincoln canceled it right away. We can also say that later on Grant said that was a mistake. He never really explained it. No, generals don't explain. Grant said the attack at Cold Harbor, where 7,000 Union troops were massacred in about half an hour, terrible slaughter. Well, that was a mistake, he said. He didn't go on 19th century Oprah Winfrey and go, oh, what, I did a terrible thing, I'm so ashamed, those poor... No, it was a mistake. The end. He said it was a mistake. When Grant was president from 1868 onward, he showed no anti-Semitism. In fact, he appointed many Jews to high positions, and he protested against anti-Semitism in Europe, which was very unusual at the time for an American president. So it was a wartime measure, prejudice of the time, trying to deal with it sticky. Some Jews were guilty, most were not, and that's really all you can say.